Welcome into the Draft Room Podcast. My name is Summy, and I'll be your host. Seeing as how this is the first ever episode of the Draft Room Podcast, I thought it was pretty important to go over who we are and what we'll be covering and what you can expect. So to give you a synopsis, the Draft Room Podcast was born from the idea that fantasy football, as much chaos as it is, it really just comes down to science. There's a certain framework where it all makes sense. Within that framework exists all the craziness and the uncertainty on a week-to-week basis, which I like to call flexibility. But there is that framework. I'll be diving into that framework very shortly in an upcoming episode. But for now, you can go ahead and subscribe to our podcast on iTunes and Google Podcasts, as well as our YouTube page. Make sure you visit our website at draftroompodcast.com and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at draftroompod. All right, so in this episode, we'll be going over what type of analysis and content you can expect coming your way from the Draft Room Podcast. But before that, I really briefly just wanted to touch on the AFC and NFC Championship games. They were crazy. They were a roller coaster of emotions, and, they were gut-wrenching. It was... As a football fan, it was probably the best day of the season so far. We only got 2 games, but I think, to me, those 2 games felt like I was sitting there watching Red Zone for the whole day. I mean, yeah, it was 7 hours long, but still, it was only just 2 games, and those 2 games had so much excitement and controversy and talent and skill. It was just amazing to watch, man. Starting off with the NFC Championship game, it's really surprising to me that, the level of play that Sean Payton and Drew Brees and Michael Thomas showed in the first 10 to 12 weeks of the season to where they are, now, Drew Brees didn't look the same. He was off, he was overthrowing, he was underthrowing, especially that first throw to Ginn over the middle. What the heck was he doing? That was a severely underthrown pass that should have been a touchdown by Ginn on the first play. And Brees missed him. It's plain and simple. And that's been the theme ever since their bye week. I think, for them to really win that game at home, it would have really taken Drew Brees to have been on point, which he wasn't. That no call or that non-call at the end, definitely egregious. Saints fans, I sympathize with you. I'm sorry, that sucked, plain and simple. To see, your entire season wash down the drain because of inaction from an officiate, it's kind of sad. But it is what it is. At the end of the day, you can't really blame that non-call. I really think that as a true football fan, you should take a step back and really analyze what cost the Saints that game. It was Drew Brees and him missing throws. The offensive line definitely held up as much as it could have against Aaron Donald and Ndamukong Suh and Brockers. Littleton had a day that he was all over the field making tackles on Kamara and Ingram and even a couple of receivers. So the Rams definitely came to play. I thought they were the better team all around. Their roster all around is a lot better. But I think, the Saints just had that it factor. They just had that indescribable quality that makes a team great. And, plain and simple, they just didn't show up. As much as it hurts Saints fans, they just didn't show up. And, it's the Rams that are moving on to the Super Bowl. NFC Championship game was pretty wild, but it definitely didn't top the AFC Championship game. That was a wild roller coaster of a ride. I won't get into it too much, but I'm a Patriots fan. And being a Patriots fan, obviously, in my mind, I was thinking, we got this. There's no way. Defense is very porous. Tom Brady can dissect it, hands down. He's not going to have a problem moving the ball down the field. And then we got Sony. Sony's just going to kill the clock out. That's what he's there for. He's going to get 30 rushing attempts. That's pretty much what happened, right? But the game was scary. And the game was scary because, obviously, Patrick Mahomes, this guy's a prodigy. He's taken an offense that was extremely dynamic last year with Alex Smith under center, and he's turned it he's made it 10 times more dynamic. It's literally the most efficient offense I've ever seen. They had the ball for just over 20 minutes for that entire span of the game, but yet they scored as many points as the Patriots did, who possessed the ball for 40 minutes, which is insane by itself. Patrick Mahomes, he's definitely the future. Kansas City fans, you guys are good. Like, you'll be there next year. Don't worry about it. You guys are good. But I think the most impressive part of everything was, the adjustments by Brady at the line and him identifying the coverages and him being able to, just simply dissect that defense. They just couldn't do anything to stop it. As much Tony Romo was, calling the plays out beforehand. I'm sure Sutton also knew exactly what Brady was going to be doing when he audibled at the line. But, there's really nothing they could have done to stop it. They got Kendall Fuller, who's their best corner. You can't ask him to cover Gronk and Edelman at the same time. It's just not possible, right? So I think the biggest takeaway from that was there's always going to be a false narrative every season, whether it's about the Patriots or whether it's about another team. It could be a good false narrative or it could be a bad false narrative. And, for the last couple of years, obviously the Patriots have had that bad false narrative, right? Where it's Tom Brady's declining. He can't play well. He's too old. He doesn't have any skilled receivers. Gronk he's broken. He's literally broken in half. They have no run game, blah, 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 blah. So, that being taken into account, if we kind of reflect back to what the experts, quote unquote, were saying at the beginning of the season or even in last offseason, this has been the theme again for the last couple of years where the Patriots are going to suck. It's going to be the downfall of the dynasty, and, it's going to happen very, very rapidly. And that just hasn't happened. We've all kind of seen that the Patriots thrive on adaptation and they thrive on working a system that they have, and that just produces stars. They can take mediocre players and turn them into relevant stars. But again, that's kind of the one thing I want to transition into with is the false narrative part of things. We're going to be hearing a lot of false narratives in the offseason leading up to the actual NFL season. The one thing I'd like to kind of stress here is to think for yourself, to make logical assumptions by yourself. Too often I see that fantasy football players, they get into this hole of, listening to 5 or 6 or 7 or maybe even 10 different sources of news, but they're all conflicting. So, us as players, we're pretty confused about what to believe, what not to believe, especially ones that aren't as experienced with actual football or don't understand, things that have a real world impact that could also have a fantasy impact. So again, I'm here to try to educate myself as well as everyone else that's listening on how to make better informed decisions and win your fantasy football league at the same time, which never hurts. But jumping into the show now, I'm going to go over briefly what we'll be covering during the offseason, the preseason, and in season. So during the offseason, we'll be covering, once free agency opens, we'll be covering obviously all the free agency acquisitions by teams, the cuts, any contract extensions, which is super important to look out for, especially if you're playing Dynasty, to keep an eye out for expiring contracts. So we'll be covering all of that and how it actually affects your fantasy roster moving into next season. I'll be doing a breakdown of incoming rookies as well. We'll be breaking them down by position. So we'll run through the top 10 of each skilled position. That's quarterback, wide receiver, running back, and tight end. And that's coming very, very soon. So keep an eye out for that. We'll also be looking into the coaching changes that have been going on. So a couple of key things to note with coaching changes is that historic trends and data are usually pretty indicative of how a coach is able to perform on average. So, for example, last season when Norv Turner was hired as the Panthers offensive coordinator, looking back at Norv Turner's historical data, we saw that he used a bell cow back with every single team that he was with. We just simply, as analysts or quote unquote experts, just simply refuse to see Christian McCaffrey as one of those workhorses. Obviously, now in hindsight, we see that, we should have stuck with the data and the analysis and the historical trends we should have stuck with all of that. Christian McCaffrey was the guy. CJ Anderson didn't even see the field. He got cut. So I think coaching changes are very, very important to focus on. We'll be looking at, previous offensive and defensive rankings. We'll be looking at their personnel usage and what positions they utilize the most and their overall strengths and flaws. As far as preseason goes, once preseason starts, we'll get into seasonal rankings. So I'll rank out positionally where I feel like players will finish the fantasy football season in 2019. I'll go over detailed year-over-year stat comparisons and analysis and trends, of course, to determine where we should be taking certain players in our drafts. Speaking of drafts, once we get around draft season, a couple common themes that you'll hear from me are going to be value-based drafting and tiered rankings. So these are both a part of that draft room fantasy football framework that I touched upon earlier, and we'll definitely dive into that in an upcoming show. And of course, again, I'll make it downloadable for everyone in a file located on my website. Jumping into the in-season weekly shows. So once the NFL season actually kicks off, we'll be looking to do weekly previews for certain key games that we feel are the most fantasy relevant. There's a lot of analysts out there that will do the previews and the rankings and projections, for let's say week 4 of fantasy football. And then come week 5, when, it turned out that their rankings were all garbage, they'll put out rankings for week 5 now. But you would have made decisions on their advice in week 4, and you would have lost that week. So what we'll be doing differently here is that we'll be looking not only to do the previews, but the next week we'll be doing reviews and going back into our projections and rankings and see what we got right, what we got wrong, and most importantly, what we can learn and apply the next time we're in that situation. That's the only way that we can get better. Another thing that we'll be covering, of course, during the NFL season will be weekly rankings and projections, like I just spoke about. They'll be updated on our website during the regular season. And if you subscribe to our newsletter, which you can do at our website, draftroompodcast.com, we'll actually be sending them right to your inbox every week, so you don't have to do anything. And one of the last things that we'll be covering during the regular season will be waiver pickups. We'll cover, waiver pickups across all formats. That includes the regular waiver system, fab budgets, as well as the free-for-all free agency pools. And that'll do it for the first ever episode of the Draft Room Podcast. Please make sure you don't forget to subscribe to our podcast at Apple iTunes or Google Podcasts. Make sure you follow us on Twitter and Instagram at DraftRoomPod. And make sure you visit our website at draftroompodcast.com. Until next time.